folks. Today is January 25th, and the topic is the China challenge. And indeed, China is a big topic and a challenge. But before I start substantively, I have some announcements, and I'm going to read from the script so I don't miss anything, which is that on February 8th, which is 2 weeks from today, this will become a live Zoom webinar. So I'll again speak for about a half an hour, and then there'll be about a half an hour when you can ask questions. And you can ask questions through Zoom's Q&A feature. OLLI members who have paid this year's dues will receive an email with a link before the webinar. So watch your email inbox in the days before for the link. I hasten to add that this will be recorded also in the usual fashion. So for those of you who like the previous version, where you can just click on and then either watch it or just listen to it or listen to it in the car, you can continue to do that if you wish. And of course, for those of you, you can also click out the Q&A period and just listen to the talk. So there's a lot of flexibility, but this adds the Zoom webinar for those of you who would like to be able to ask questions and who would like this more live version. So I look forward to answering your questions when we come around to the next time. Remember, it's going to be Monday the 8th at 11 o'clock, the usual time. And I might remind you, if I can remember, at the end of today's presentation. So China. Let me give you a preface by saying that many of you heard a good talk by Ben Reed, my politics faculty, who is a China scholar. And this, I think, was good by way of background to today and subsequent talks. I am not a China scholar. I don't speak or read Chinese. I look at China the way I look at other parts of the world in terms of its role in international affairs and in terms of U.S. foreign policy and policy of other countries. Let me also say that for better or for worse, I have had the great opportunities to travel quite a lot in China over the last 25 years to various provinces, including the Northwest province where the Uyghurs live, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And I spent 2 months once in Shanghai teaching in the UC Education Abroad program. So I've had some physical contact with China. And when you probably know from your own travels, even if you don't speak the language, even if you're not studying the society, if you're traveling and sort of see the country, see the people and so forth, it doesn't make you into an expert. What it makes you do, I think, or for many of us, is you want to read, or you read with more interest about that country, right? So when I went to Turkey, I was just a tourist, but I started reading after I came home about Turkey with more interest. So I just want to give you that as background so you don't mistake me as, being in the category of Ben Reed, studying the domestic politics of China. Now, China, as almost all of you will know, now has a population of about 1.4 billion people. It's technologically an advanced country. Its economy is largely thriving. Its growth rate this past months, while everybody's economy was collapsing, was still somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 or 3%. And I think it's useful to understand that China plays a fairly major economic role in the world. China is the main trading partner. That is to say, countries that get exports from China, For the United States, it gets about 16% of US trade comes from China. In the case of Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, about 3-4%. Even the Netherlands, 3.2% of its exports go to the Netherlands. If you look at it from the reverse, that is to say, the imports to China from the rest of the world, China gets large imports from South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the US, and for that matter, Germany. Now, that's all relevant because most countries in the world recognize that they are tangled up in economic relations with China in a very kind of serious and important way. And stopping its trade with China would be detrimental to their own economies. International trade being reduced for China, that is, say, its exports may also have an impact on China. But the China trade has important impacts in many countries other than China. And so the trade relationship has been important for many years. If we go back for just 1 second to the Obama administration, which is now being criticized for its China policy, was that Obama and his administration were soft on China. And certainly the Republicans, but even some of the Democrats are saying that right now. Now, what Obama tried to do, which it seems to me is being unfairly criticized, is to say, okay, so China is going to be a major economic actor in the world. Let's sort of make linkages and create a network which can influence and pressure China. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a very important idea of knitting in a whole bunch of countries in a trade relationship. China hadn't joined, of course, but the theory was that it might actually join somewhere around the world. And the other sort of Obama initiative saying, well, China has an interest on climate change, so let's work with China on climate change. So the Obama administration's kind of attitude was, let's work with China where we can, and let's have alliances which might have some leverage on China in one fashion or another. It's just, I'm going to leave the economics for a minute, but before I do, I would just say that for 64 countries of the world, out of 200, China is the most important trading partner. Okay? And for, let's say, the US, it's only 38% of its imports and exports are China linked, right? So for many countries, China is a really important trade country of one kind or another. For the US, less so. And the reason that that's important, and the reason I'm emphasizing that, is other countries, non-US countries, would be very leery to have a reduction or obstacles put in the way of their trading relationships with China. Some countries export primary products, minerals, and so forth. Other countries export goods, import goods, and almost everybody is entangled with China technologically one way or the other. So then you get to the Trump administration, which blew hot and cold on China, and I don't want to review all of that, only to say, if you were China, you would be alternately amazed, confounded, and totally angry at what was going on. One day, the administration said one thing, both in terms of sort of trade relations and tariffs, and the next day, the administration would try to make a deal of one kind or another. Then it would impact Huawei and all of the technology issues, would accuse China of wrongdoing and saying that, we're not going to deal with any Huawei products and so forth. So the best way to summarize the Trump years was a kind of confusion both for domestic actors, economic and political actors dealing with China, and for China itself. Now, by the time you got to the last 3 or 4 days of the Trump administration, Secretary of State Pompeo then proceeded to throw a major monkey wrench into the U.S. relationship with China by accusing China of being engaging in genocide with the Uyghurs, by accusing them of all kinds of different things of one kind or another, and making changes in economic policy, and also doing something which is going to be very costly, and about which there's an article in the New York Times today, of trying to regularize the relationship with Taiwan. Now, what needs to be known here is that the relationship between the U.S. and Taiwan, which has been very close economically, technologically, they are big chips producer, for all kinds of technologies, has been a sort of non-official relationships. There are no ambassadors exchanged. There was a rule that no government officials would go to Taiwan in their official capacity. So to allow the fiction that Taiwan was not an independent sovereign state, and that this then made it easier to relate to China, which of course thinks of Taiwan as being part of China. But it was a very delicate dance, and it was maintained through multiple administrations. For reasons, Pompeo decided to, and Trump decided to do that. First, they sent Secretary of Health Aznar over there, who was the first formal government official ever to go to Taiwan. That really angered the Chinese. And then Pompeo's various statements and so forth. I must say that the throwing a monkey wrench into the affairs of U.S. foreign policy was not just in Pompeo's last days, was not just China. For example, he said that the U.S. Was saying that the Houthis in Yemen were a terrorist organization, which led to screams of pain from the World Food Program and UNICEF, because it meant that trying to keep some of these Yemeni Houthis alive, children are dying of malnutrition like flies, would be badly handicapped because of that announcements. And they were pleading with the administration to please take that back, because it was going to lead to hundreds of thousands of premature deaths and starving children. So they did all kinds of odd things. The general consensus is the purpose of all of this in the last few days of the Trump administration was to hem in the Biden administration. So then let me talk a little bit about this genocide issue up in Uyghur land. Now, this is not just some obscure issue, because obviously the Chinese are very angry, and having the Chinese do revengeful acts is not terribly useful either for American policy or international affairs. So the Trump administration declared, right? Pompeo declared that what China was doing in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs was genocide. Now, it's useful to know a couple of things. First, of course, as you know, there are about 1 million people in labor camps up there, and Uyghurs are not ethnically Chinese, and they're mostly Muslims, and they are a minority that has wanted some autonomy. In the past, the Uyghurs have engaged in some terrorist acts. And in a way, the Chinese government in Xi wants to bring the Uyghurs to heel. Now, the situation in those labor camps is obviously most unpleasant and most inappropriate. But the question is it genocide? And I would argue that actually, whatever else it is, it's not genocide, because genocide refers to something fairly specific, which is killing people. And let me read you the various 5 criteria for genocide. One is killing a group of people, which the Chinese are not doing. The other is causing bodily and human harm, which it's not clear the Chinese are doing, although labor camps are unpleasant. the trying to physically destruct an ethnic group, uh, then forcibly transferring children of the group to or away from mothers. The Chinese seem not to be doing that. And the other measure is to prevent births. Now, that's pretty interesting because one of the things that the Chinese government seems to be doing is sterilizing some of the women Uyghurs in hard labor camps. And of course, from Pompeo's and evangelical point of view, that actually is tantamount to murdering potential embryos, let's say. But in general parlance, in general international law, it is best to call genocide when it actually is happening and not to accuse and not to weaken, in a sense, the concept of genocide, that when things are happening somewhere that are counter to human rights and the Human Rights Declaration, that those are automatically genocide. So again, I think this was overstepping and making things worse. Countries in the modern times don't like to be accused of committing genocide. And while it is obviously true that the human rights of these people and the human and are being violated, and that the International Declaration of Human Rights certainly comes into play in terms of what's happening to Uyghurs, it's kind of a bad policy on the part of the U.S. And I think it ought to be regretted. Now, why am I making a big deal out of it? I'm making a big deal out of it, because, of course, the Uyghur problem is a big problem, and how we relate to China is a major issue. But I'm also making a big deal out of it because Anthony Blinken, who is the new Secretary of State designee, when he was asked during his confirmation hearings whether he agreed with the Trump administration that the treatment of Uyghurs constituted genocide in China, said he agreed. And that is actually quite alarming. Because most of the foreign policy elite of the Biden administration, that is, say, Blinken, Haynes in the security field, and Sullivan, national security person, all were on board with Obama when he was running China policy. And they have hardened their positions on China and have become China hawks. And I would suggest to you that the very worst way to deal with China is to take on a hawkish posture, because that then weakens your ability to have leverage on China, to use soft power, to some extent economic power, technological power, to deal with issues which need to be dealt with, and alienating the Chinese, just simply getting them angry, will lead the Chinese to dig in. Now, I can give you one example of how the Chinese have already dug in on this, which is that the accusations with respect to technology and making it difficult for the Chinese to access the technology, the chips, and so forth, which they were used to importing, because the Chinese also import technology, they don't just export it. Those have already led to a pronouncement on the part of the Chinese government, and I think they will follow through on it, saying, hey, we can't count on the rest of the world. We can't count on the Americans, even their influence on South Korea and the Taiwanese, to provide us with the give and take in technology. We better become self-sufficient. And making China self-sufficient is counter to the interest of making China as interdependent as possible, so that the international community can have an impact on China. And China is, maybe the biggest kid on the block. But if you recall, the degree to which Chinese economics are intertwined, excuse me, with quite a lot of countries in the world, including countries like Germany, that it doesn't help to push China into a corner where they feel, okay, the rest of the world is hostile. We're going to do our own thing here. It becomes very dangerous. Excuse me. So, two things have already happened. And for example, the New York Times covers it, which is that China is pretty sophisticated in satellites and missiles technology. And, any kind of alienation from the rest of the world, like the West, like the United States, sorry, and like, for that matter, even Russia, China gets pushed onto itself. It's a big enough country to become fairly self-sufficient. And being self-sufficient then allows China to kind of plod around the world and really push and really become dangerous. Which gets me back to the Taiwan discussion, right? So you take these measures and you kind of modestly regularize Taiwan. And then the very first thing that China does is they send military planes into the Taiwanese Straits to warn, you mess around, we're right here, we can do you in, right? And while the situation in Hong Kong, as you know, is quite bad and it's difficult exactly what to do about it, if the Chinese decided, okay, we're sufficiently alienated from the world, they're not going to dare have a war with us, we're just going to take over Taiwan. This becomes very dangerous, and we will have a very unpleasant, nasty war on our hands with a very capable military China. So before one takes these sort of measures that make you feel good, I'm taking action against China. We got to stop China. We are going to show that we can fail not completely normalize, but somewhat normalize our relationship with Taiwan, and we will rub it in that this COVID virus is actually a China virus, and that China is committing genocide in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs. It strikes me as absolutely the worst trajectory for a foreign policy to create a living situation with China for the rest of the century. China has global interests. China has climate interests. China will have trade interests. China will have technology interests. Why not build on those and enmesh China as much as possible so that China perceives it in its own national interest to be reasonable in world affairs, or at least reasonable on some issues in world affairs. Now, what about its domestic affairs? Yes, it's an authoritarian state, fair enough. Will it liberalize soon? Probably not. Is a situation with the Uyghurs really bad? Does the world have to speak up when, 1 million odd people are put in hard labor camps? Yes, they do. But there are ways and ways of doing so. So, for example, one of the things that we've done, which is probably not very stupid, is a little stupid, but not very stupid, is to say, okay, in these labor camps, they produce cotton, and this cotton gets exported and used by multinational corporations. Why don't we tell the multinational corporations to stop importing cotton from up there and substitute cotton from elsewhere, even if it's slightly more expensive, perhaps, in order to give the Chinese a measure? If that's how you produce cotton, through forced labor, we really don't want your cotton, right? So that's a slightly softer approach to it. Ditto in terms of Taiwan. Why not back off? The Taiwan is flourishing. Taiwan is intermeshed. Even the Chinese have a lot of trade. Mainland Chinese have a lot of trade from Taiwan, and they currently get useful technology from Taiwan. Why not encourage that and not push the button on Taiwanese sovereignty and independence? And get the Chinese to say, no, Taiwan is actually an integral part of China. So am I soft peddling the bad policies of China? I don't actually think so. I think that the Biden administration looks as if it's correct in saying we need alliances. And it seems to me that when the European Union and the US are more aligned and aligned, when we push China with large groups of people where the Chinese have interest and exports and imports, it will be a lot easier than this go it alone, America first policy that we've been pursuing. And therefore, I think the Biden administration is completely correct saying we need to rebuild our alliances. With rebuilt alliances, it will be easier. And the Chinese, for the US and the West, and the Chinese understand that because they sent a message before Biden actually became inaugurated, which was to quickly make a trade agreement with the European Union and saying, hey, we can do this without the United States. We can make our own agreements, including with the Western alliance of the United States. And the Europeans, especially because of Germany and its economic relations with China, big car exporters and so forth with China, Angela Merkel were pushing and saying, yes, this is a very modest trade agreement, but let's make it. And that was kind of a symbolic act. It doesn't have major economic impact, but a symbolic act of the Chinese saying, look, we can do without the US, we can make alliances, we go around the world. We have economic relations with all over Africa, all over Latin America, all over the world. The rest of the world needs us. Don't criticize us. So the tone, it seems to me, of the Biden administration is going to be a huge challenge, especially when so many people in the Biden administration at the top of the foreign policy wing have sort of become hawkish on China. And, the word hawkish can mean any number of things. But I would think that I would tolerate the criticisms of Republicans by saying it is not the tone here that matters. It is the outcomes, and we need to have reasonable relations. And China is interested in having reasonable relations with the United States, provided we don't, accuse them of genocide. We don't accuse them of the fact that the U.S. has the largest outbreak of the COVID virus on China, right? The same virus that escaped the Wuhan went to other countries who are managing the virus much better than we are. So our mismanagement of COVID is on us. It's not on the Chinese. And so the sooner we get off this bandwagon of accusing China right and left, and rather doing quiet diplomacy and getting agreements when they can be gotten, and recognize that China can become very dangerous in outer space and technology, later in the 20th century, and that a way needs to be found to manage a difference. Here, the management of American-Soviet relationships in terms of open skies, in terms of nuclear matters, much of which were attacked by the Trump administration and hopefully will be put back into gear by the Trump administration, and hopefully the Russians will actually have an interest in doing that for reasons we can discuss some other time. That's actually a much better route to go. On climate, on military matters, on economic matters, quiet diplomacy, and interlinking China with the rest of the world rather than isolating China and attacking China seems to me, obviously you want to criticize when criticism is due, but this sort of hawkish kind of attitudes towards China seems to me counter to our American interests and the interests of the West. And for that matter, I think that is the big challenge. So the big challenge, it seems to me, is to put the US-China relations into some kind of coherent track again, and hopefully even the more hawkish-sounding administration people during their confirmation hearings will back off and become slightly more reasonable. Anyway, we will have to go talk again about China, and more specifically, it is a very important power in the world. US foreign policy and Western policy needs to address it, and it needs to run a parallel track to the COVID disaster that's worldwide and particularly serious in the United States. So let me remind you that on the 8th of February, we will be on the new live web seminar, and you will be able to get online and click onto that. And I look forward to seeing you then.